Hello and welcome to the Macon Atlanta podcast. I'm your host, Brent Macon. We are sitting down with inspiring Atlantans to talk big questions, bold ideas, and better living. Our guest today is one of my professional heroes in Atlanta, David Jernigan. He's the president and CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Atlanta. He previously served as the deputy superintendent for Atlanta Public Schools and was the founding principal and executive director for KIPP Metro Atlanta Schools. I find him to be a pragmatic, compassionate leader. He's got a wealth of knowledge about education and a big heart. We discuss the current moment, what families are dealing with in terms of mental health, technology in schools, still being a couple years out from COVID lockdowns, and what it takes to run a world-class school. I asked him how he would design it if he were starting from scratch, and I think he's got a lot of leadership lessons that apply whether you're in education or really any field. So thank you, David, for the time. Hope you all enjoy the episode today.
David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate the time.
Absolutely.
So I have heard you say in the past that before you landed in education, you considered a career in business. And it was a pretty formative kind of summer experience that shifted that.
Yeah.
What is it that brought you to the realm of education? And then what is it that keeps you here?
Yeah. So I was an undergrad student at the University of North Carolina in business school, doing all the hard work of a business major. And I had a summer experience where part of my scholarship program allowed me to go to Houston to teach in a middle school program. And I tell people all the time that the teaching bug hit me that summer. I saw the power of connecting with young people and the power of pursuing a career that was bigger than just about money. And I came back to Chapel Hill after that summer and said, I think I'm supposed to be working with kids. And I fought it actually for a while. And it was that tension between my brain and my heart. My brain was saying, you're never going to make any money in doing this. There's not really a career trajectory here. But my heart was like, but this is what I'm supposed to do. And so I fought it for a while all throughout college and even up to graduation. I was still going through all the steps of interviewing with consulting firms, investment banking company firms, and doors just kept closing. And the only door left open in the end was a Teach for America placement here in Atlanta. And I asked for a deferral a few times before making the decision. And ultimately I was like, okay, God, this is what I'm supposed to do. Got it. And so I came to Atlanta, and I guess the rest is history, as they say.
I'd imagine there's a lot of people out there who are in a job. Maybe it feels good. Maybe it doesn't feel good, but they're wondering, is this my vocation?
Yeah.
Is this what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Has that always felt clear? Have you had seasons where that has waned or been stronger? And what has that been like?
I think I've never doubted that I'm in exactly the work that I'm supposed to be doing. There certainly have been seasons where the work got really challenging, or I questioned what the next chapter would be. But I think I have, I will say when I first started as a teacher, I was a third grade teacher in the west side of Atlanta. I spent that first year thinking, gosh, I worked my tail off in college to be teaching third graders, and I'm not using much of anything I learned in college in this current career. But quickly thereafter, when I launched a charter school and, found myself quickly leveraging all the things I'd learned in business school, it became clear in retrospect why those steps were all necessary. And so I think there's an element of faith in everything for my journey that okay, I may not be able to clearly see why something's happening right now in this season, but I have an ultimate belief that it's going to be clear down the road. And that's sort of what my life experience has been.
Yeah. And can you give us a quick stop through what some of those major stops that you've had in education have been?
Yeah. So I started off, as I said, as a third grade teacher in Atlanta. I only taught for 2 years. And, I was 24 thinking, what should my next move be? And there was an opportunity to work with a growing, had really just started network of charter schools called KIPP, the Knowledge is Power program. And they were looking for someone to open a KIPP school here in Atlanta. And so I had a chance to open KIPP Ways Academy, one of the first KIPP schools here. It was a 5 through 8 college preparatory charter middle school, which I ran that for 6 years. And after doing that, I think we recognized the need to both start earlier and also have opportunities for kids after high school. And so I had the opportunity to launch the KIPP network here in Atlanta and launch a region of KIPP schools. So I ran that for several years. And then in 2014, we had a new superintendent coming to Atlanta who was looking for her number two, was looking for someone who kind of knew the Atlanta landscape, but maybe wasn't inside Atlanta public schools. They were just coming out of the cheating scandal. And I got a phone call and went and had some conversations and became her deputy superintendent, which I was at Atlanta Public Schools for 6 years. And then as her tenure was ending, I really started thinking about, what does the next chapter look like for me? Explored a lot of different things. And ultimately, I think that process, because I had started interviewing outside of Atlanta, that process for me really solidified my love for this city. Because every time I would fly out for an interview somewhere else, it became clear that I just didn't feel right. I was like, I'm really meant to be serving the kids of Atlanta, at least for this next chapter. Who knows if that's forever, but and this opportunity with Boys and Girls Clubs came around. So I'm now serving as the president and CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs in Metro Atlanta.
What is it about Atlanta that made this feel like definitely home?
It's hard to say unless you've experienced Atlanta, but it's such a special city to me. I mean, I grew up in the South and eastern part of North Carolina, very rural part of North Carolina. I know I want to be in an urban environment. I love the energy of this city, but I think it has all of the great things that the South has to offer in terms of Southern hospitality, great food, great entertainment, and great people. And I think part of it too is it feels like a big small town to me. Yeah. Like it's very rare that I go out in the city and I don't run into people that I know now. And that only happens with time and with just really being out in the community. And I feel like, people talk about the Atlanta way, and, that has both some negative connotations probably for some, but also I think there are some positive aspects of the Atlanta way where it's really a relational city. Yeah. And so I think that coupled with, I will just say, the needs in this city and the opportunities to serve kids who have historically been underserved. And, we continue to be a city that is not doing right by our kids. And so my heart still is set on trying to be a part of that solution. And so I don't feel like the work's done there.
Yeah, makes total sense. I always say the big little city too, where it's like huge, obviously international Olympic city, a ton going on. And yet, my brother and I will run down Peachtree Road sometimes at the earliest part of a workday. And it's like in New York, you're not going to run down Fifth Avenue and stay alive. Right. Yeah. And so it's just cool that you can kind of get your head around what's there. And then in my lead program, talked a lot around, we're talking about beloved community and racial reconciliation. And Atlanta's got all of the challenges and opportunities and then obligation to be a global leader and a beacon around. If we can't figure it out here, it probably won't get figured out. And we have to figure it out given our legacy and history and present day challenges.
Yeah. So couldn't agree more.
I totally feel that. And then I'm curious, sitting where you are today, what are you seeing in the field and how is it going for kids and families in 2024? So I feel like I heard a lot, and it was a very top of mind subject during the pandemic around how's everybody faring? Yeah. And not that it's out of vogue, but just curious, a couple years removed, what's going on right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone talks about it. And so I appreciate this, that mental health is top of mind for folks when it comes to young people. And we see it all the time in our clubs. And I think it's seen definitely in schools. I think it's always been there. I just think we're more comfortable talking about it now. Yeah. I do think social media and technology has exacerbated the issues around mental health. Yeah. But on the positive side, I think there are more resources and more support around mental health for young people. I also think we are continuing to see the impact of the pandemic on the academic side of the house for kids. I think there's all kinds of data that shows that young people are continue to struggle as a result of some of the lack of education they were receiving during the pandemic. And honestly, I think we are just beginning to see the impact of what is happening in the field of education that I think will have a cascading effect on young people. And that is, I just think there's been a mass exodus of people in education, going into education.
On the teacher side.
On the teacher side. Yeah. And just so much that has happened politically in the world of education that impacts kids. And I think we sometimes forget how much this stuff does impact kids. Whether it's, just so many kids sitting in classrooms with long-term substitutes or just not having people that are equipped to support them. Yeah. So I see that. And I will also say I see a generation of young people who think differently about the world, and in some ways in a really positive way. And I try to, I was with a young person yesterday, and I think about his journey, and he has shared a lot of his journey with me. But I see young people that are far more inclusive and far more open to, even the conversation around pronouns. Like young people, like, they don't think twice about it. It's just, but adults get caught up in those kinds of things. And I see a generation of young people that are just far more open.
Yeah. I mean, my N equals 2, the positions that I've hired for in the last couple of years, nanny and gym director for the little gym, kids gymnastics gym. And the number of former teachers who have applied for both of those. Yeah. And you hear a lot of folks who are hired at nanny, but it's people are going to get a raise by leaving the teaching field, and think about the hours and the predictability and what it means, and totally hearing and feeling that exodus. Yeah. I'm curious. I want to double click for a second on the mental health point. And I know that books are being written. This is a whole field of conversation. Yeah. So I don't want to wormhole us here too much, but I'm curious, like, how's that presenting for kids? And is it different notably now in 2024 than maybe 2019? Or does it really feel, can you pandemic isolate? Can you social media isolate? Like, what's actually happening and what are you seeing?
Yeah. And, I don't know that I see it. First of all, I'm not into the day-to-day operation of a club. Sure. So my interaction with kids is somewhat limited. So I have data in terms of what I hear from our club directors, and I'm not in a school setting anymore. So we're in a slightly less structured environment than a school. But from what I understand is happening on the ground, particularly in our clubs, is that the behaviors that staff are having to deal with are at an all-time extreme in terms of just kids showing up in a way that would reflect that they're not well, like mentally, that they are stressed, that they don't have some of the social skills. And I think some of that is like being in a pandemic for a couple of years where they weren't, in particularly younger people who just didn't have the interactions in a classroom setting you would typically have. So those behaviors just, I think, are more reflective of just lack of socialization more than anything. But I also think, as I said before, I think we're able to name, and I think young people are emboldened to name things like how they're feeling in a way that I don't think they were before. And a young person saying, "Hey, I think I'm feeling depressed." It's far more common than I think it used to be. It used to be very taboo to talk about, some of your health. But I think that's a positive thing, that we are equipping young people with both the awareness, we're talking about it, and the number of times I have conversations with friends who bring up, so I was with my therapist last week. It's just sort of common now. Like, everybody has a therapist. And I think that's a really positive evolution that I don't know that the pandemic was the turning point, but it feels like it really accelerated the sort of conversations around mental health.
Do you perceive a risk of over-rotating on that towards kids? Have you seen that present at all?
I don't know that I've seen it firsthand, but I think that risk exists in almost everything we are experiencing right now. But yes, I think that I think we can be reactive to kids talking about their feelings, that and maybe we're not teaching kids resiliency and teaching kids the grit that they might have to have. So I think there's always that fear of, how do you strike the right balance in terms of support that young people need? Yeah,
totally. It feels like a really tough one in conversations that I'm having with other parents, is like, how do you validate and make it accommodating versus, I think it was a podcast where they talked about the suicide screening that they're doing sometimes when kids go in for a bellyache, and they're asking if they thought about killing themselves recently, and if they're feeling like killing themselves now. And at some point, it's like, if I hear that I'm supposed to be thinking about that enough, maybe I wonder if I am thinking about that.
I wasn't before you said it. Right.
Yeah. I perceive this tricky, I don't know, fine line of getting it right without over-rotating. Curious your kind of level of optimism or pessimism, and kind of where's your meter, and why? And can you maybe give some specifics that point to that?
I will be honest, it's hard to be optimistic some days. When I think about the 24 years I've been doing this work in Atlanta, everything from constant turnover in leadership. I tell people I don't know many superintendents in Metro Atlanta that left on their own terms. I can actually only think of one or two in the 24 years I've been here. A constant churn in leadership that has a cascading effect on teachers, on kids. The politics that have entered into education in the last few years has been really disheartening. And the amount of things coming at schools now from various political corners, it's just, I think it's disheartening for people who are trying to do good work, and the noise can just become such a distraction. If you look at everything from educational outcomes for young people and all the things we've talked about relative to their mental health, there's a lot of reasons not to have hope. I will say, in balance, though, I tend to still be more optimistic for a couple of reasons. One, I appreciate that most leaders that I engage with are not walking around with their head in the sand. I think there is a general acknowledgement that the state of our youth is at risk, and that folks have got to lean in around it. I applaud our mayor, for example, who declared 2022 to be the year of the youth, and he put money and resources around it. He gave Boys and Girls Clubs $1 million to help support expanding services to teens. And I engage with a lot of donors, corporate sponsors, foundations who are doubling down in their support for young people. So that gives me hope. But honestly, the thing that gives me the most hope is the chance to engage with young people. And when I do get out into clubs, as I said, I was just out in a club yesterday and just hanging out for a very brief period, but just in a few interactions, I left thinking, these are some amazing young people. Our future's in good hands. And they have a perspective that at times for older generations is hard to grapple with, but I think they give me hope more than anything.
Yeah. And looking at, the statistics and taking an interested but outsider perspective on this. Let's look at the educational outcome statistics and how kids are doing mentally and reading levels and otherwise. I feel like one could definitely conclude the whole thing doesn't work. Yeah. And maybe it was designed for a factory era with the bells and the ways we're educating kids and kind of rote. You're sitting at a desk all day, not moving around, maybe nutritionally deficient. You could point to a lot of potential reasons, but you could come to a sum total conclusion I need to scrap this and start over. Is that a fair argument? Is it foul? Is it just so impractical that it's not really even worth entertaining? Or is the system solvable and we just have to do it better? How do you think about that from a systems perspective?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think it's fair to say if you look based on outcomes that something's not working and something needs to be undone and probably completely rethought. On the other hand, I will say, I think we sometimes in education make the mistake of throwing the baby out with the bathwater or over calibrating in one direction. I think about what happened in literacy, and, there was a time when everyone learned how to read the same way through phonics. And then all of a sudden someone thought we should shift to whole language. And there was a generation of kids that we were experimenting with this way of teaching kids how to read, when the foundations of the science around reading is pretty sound and fundamental. And for whatever reason, we abandoned it. And now we're coming back to recognize that there's the basics, that there's some real power in them. And so I actually tend to be one that's how do we get back to the basics? We have to evolve. We have to figure out how you integrate technology into instruction. And this is where I think the Boys and Girls Clubs continues to be very relevant, is that we recognize with all the evolution, and we've integrated esports, we've integrated all kinds of technology into our programming. But at the end of the day, our young people come back for the human interaction they have with the adults who are caring adults in that facility, and the youth that they, become friends with. And so I come back to, I think education, ultimately the lever of change is the teacher. And it's the quality of how we have equipped a teacher to provide instruction to young people. And we have to evolve their skill set. But sometimes I think we make it more complicated than it needs to be. If I were going to scrap it all and start over again, I would go back to many of the foundational things that I did when I started Kip Ways Academy. There's so much of the formula that worked, and I don't know that it all has to be as complicated as we sometimes make it.
Yeah. I have a few follow-up questions there. One, can you tell me more about what happened with reading? And for anybody listening who's not familiar, I didn't know that the science changed materially.
Yeah. So there's sort of always been two fundamental ways of teaching kids to read, at least for like our generation. The sort of old school way was phonics, where you're teaching sounds and you're teaching kids how to break down words and how to decode a word. And it's teaching their phonemic awareness in order to be able to figure out what a word means to create meaning, versus a whole language approach that is teaching more of a sight-based words, where it's through memorization, where you're like memorizing a bunch of words and you're using context clues to piece together what the sentence is saying. There was a whole movement, and if you Google Lucy Calkins and some of the controversy around the research that has now come out around whole language approach, but there was a whole movement for, let's say, a generation of kids where whole language was adopted. And if you were a more affluent kid in a literacy rich environment, whole language probably worked. There are a lot of people who probably learned how to read through whole language. I think it particularly has shown to not be effective for kids in lower income communities where you may not be in that kind of environment. You may not have a parent who is reading to you every night, or you may not have a lot of books around you. And so the fundamentals of teaching kids phonics has been in many school districts was thrown out. Now, I'm not one who would say like the Lucy Calkins whole language approach is completely wrong. I think there are elements of it that were great that I used in my own school. I just think when we went away from the basics of phonics, we lost our way. Got
it. I hope they figured it out by the time my 3-year-old is like really getting there. The clock is ticking.
I'm sure they will.
And then you mentioned like the basics and what's worked well and what you would kind of go back to at KIPP. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like what have you seen truly work the best and make the best, both like learning, but then whole child raising environment?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the whole child, because the learning component is an important part of it. But I think what we tried to do at KIPP was a holistic approach that recognized that young people need a whole set of supports beyond just academics. Now, we at KIPP back in those days, and this is not true still today, but we had kids in school from 7:30 until 5 o'clock every day.
Wow.
They had Saturday school twice a week. We had an extra month during the summer when we were in school. So it was a lot more time. Yeah. And with that time, we were able to incorporate things like healthy lifestyles programming with sports and extracurricular activities and enrichment experiences that for a lot of the kids we were serving wouldn't have access to those opportunities outside of school. And so we were able to incorporate some of those things into our day. But I would say fundamentally what made our school work so well was the culture that we created. A lot of what gets in the way of learning in the school environment is just the distractions, the behavior, the challenges, and the expectations. And so I had a team, and I'll be honest in saying I've grappled with over time how scalable this was. But what I know is I had a team of educators who were willing to do whatever it takes for kids, who had extraordinarily high expectations for our kids, and created a culture where we expected the best of them and we got the best from them. Now, there are many things I would do differently. I'll be very clear about that too. I think we probably were too punitive sometimes. It probably wasn't quite as nurturing as it could have been. We maybe over-calibrated on like no excuses. But there was something about that no excuses culture that I think really challenged kids to rise to their best selves. The other thing we did that I think is a critical part of a child's education is we incorporated a lot of experiences outside of school. So we would take kids on field trips. They had to earn them. So there's this whole character development part, but we had a whole behavior management system where kids had to earn opportunities. And it included pretty cool out of school experiences. So we would take our 5th graders to Tybee Island for a weekend and just getting them out into the marsh and doing a whole experience out on the beaches. And for many of our kids, it was their first time in the ocean. We took them into 5th grade to Washington, D.C. and, got to see their nation's capital. And then they would go to New York City. We did a whole outdoor leadership experience in North Carolina mountains. And then our first class actually went to Ghana in Africa for 2 weeks. And I'm still in touch with many of those young people who are part of that experience. They're no longer young. They're in their 30s now. But the transformative nature of those kinds of experiences, I think we're still sit with them, and I think had a profound impact on how they see the world and how they think about themselves in that world. And so I think some of those elements you can scale. What I will say I know to be true is that what ultimately made that the magic in that formula work were the people I was able to hire. And that is the challenge around scaling it. And I think KIPP locally and nationally, and like every, organization that's tried to scale in education, they have grappled with that tension around how do you find that many people with that level of skill and passion for this work to be able to replicate the success of a few schools. Yeah,
totally. The culture of excellence or the expectation setting that we're going to get something out of you that you might not even know you have in you, but we believe that it's in there and we're going to pull it out. I've experienced it and what it's different, how it's different to be in that environment compared to not, and what you can do that you don't know. It feels huge from a child perspective, also from a staff perspective. And I'm big on trying to think about incentives. And one of the things that I would perceive from the outside is that one thing the school and education system lacks is market incentives for teachers and otherwise. And so I would think, if there's a commensurate earnings opportunity that might keep a talented, hungry person there beyond just, an indefatigable hope of improving the community, that might help. Curious what you think about that kind of blunt logic of throw more money at it. And then if we could be a little more nuanced, like merit-based pay for teachers, like, is that something that excites you or that you'd consider? And I know that's a little bit of a landmine in some conversations, but like curious how you think about things like that. Yeah.
So first, absolutely, I think more resources are required. If we're going to attract talent into education, you have to pay them more than $50,000, $60,000 per year. I mean, if we really want to get people to reconsider, and I think this is like especially true in the last 10 years. I mean, we were already struggling with getting people to go into the teaching field for, I would say, the last 20, 30 years. I know when I went into education 24 years ago, my mom said to me, "You're going to settle for that?" And that was her perception 24 years ago. I can't imagine what the conversation would be today if I said I'm going into teaching. So I think if we're going to have a paradigm shift in terms of, folks considering education as a career, we have to professionalize the career more. There has to be a societal shift around how we perceive educators and the value we place on them. And with that has to be more dollars. Like you can't say I value you, but I'm only paying you pennies to do this. So yes, for sure there. I am conflicted on the whole like merit-based pay for teachers, and mostly because I've tinkered in this quite a bit. What I will say about it is like philosophically, I agree with what you're saying. If you have a teacher that is working their tail off, getting results with kids and demonstrating year after year that, they're committed and doing great work, then philosophically, I would say, yes, they should get compensated more. So I took that philosophy and I tried in a small context. This is just when we had a handful of KIPP schools in a network at that point, not even at a district level, attempted to do some pay for performance type things. The challenge with it is the challenge you keep coming back to in education and in lots of other spaces is like how you define and measure success.
Sure.
And it ultimately comes back to test scores. And then ultimately you go down this path of, yes, you can measure success in other ways. So we tried to be holistic. We did parent satisfaction surveys, student satisfaction surveys, teacher observations, which can be very subjective and qualitative. And I spent probably the better part of a year and a half trying to figure this out, then trying to calibrate between, because if you're going to do it, it has to be equitable. So you have to have every evaluator calibrated on how they're evaluating success when they're going in and reviewing performance.
Trained, yeah.
Absolutely. And by the time we got to ready to implement, we recognized, and I think came to the conclusion that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. because the amount of money that we had available that would have been the difference between a high performing versus you're good versus excellent, it was minimal in the grand scheme of things. And it just wasn't worth it. And I also recognize for many of our teachers, if you say, I'll give you more money, they would take more money. But it was almost insulting to many of them to suggest that their compensation was going to be tied to their performance. Fundamentally, most of the teachers that are in the work, they're in it for the right reason. They're in it for kids. They all want to do right by kids. Not all, most, I would say, want to do right by kids. And it wasn't the motivator that I thought it would be.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there isn't still something there. I think there's a way to do it. I just don't know that anyone's figured that one out.
Yeah. Is there an amount of money that would have kept you in the classroom over time, like when you were starting to think about that transition to administration?
I'm not sure. For me, it was never about money. I mean, I became a principal making not much more than what I was making as a teacher. For me personally, it was about having more impact and being able to reach more kids and deepen my impact, and the opportunity to be challenged professionally, intellectually, and to see the leadership skills that I was growing have greater implications than just in the classroom setting. So probably not for me, but I do think there are many people in education who leave the classroom because it's the only way you make more money. And I think that system is like, I think if there's a way to address that, I would rather focus energy. And that's what I was thinking about towards the end of my time at KIPP, is how do we create career pathways that keep master teachers in the classroom and they get awarded more for staying in the classroom, that's commensurate with what like an assistant principal would make, where their decision isn't about money, but it's really about like, how do I stay in the space where I really am thriving and not have money be the determining reason they have to leave.
Yeah, totally. That pathway for master teachers feels interesting because there is a market for giving the best of what we have to offer to kids. And somebody from delivering that, whether it's education or enrichment or otherwise, is going to make money from it. And so now I'm in the kids enrichment business. And I've thought about what it means philosophically. And if you don't let it happen in a school, so like if the best teacher doesn't have uncapped earnings, but there is a market for giving kids great and premium access to things, then you remove it from a school environment, you shift it to the private sector, and then it almost gets abstracted away from the public. Yeah. Right. And then it's only kids who can afford it.
That's right.
And so it's like, rather than, a teacher who has resources and is able to deliver a world-class facility, but when they also have music lessons in their class, for example, it's someone in a private sector delivering the music lesson and accruing the dollars that way. And maybe that's the way that it works most efficiently in the capitalist system, but who loses tends to be the kids in public school, where there's a brain drain from their instructors. Yeah. And so I that's where I can't help but wonder, if there was a way that the best teachers could know that from the moment you're going into college, you have a relatively comparable, even if different, earnings trajectory by going into the classroom compared to many of your private sector opportunities. Like if that starts to change the game long term, I have to think it might. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think to your beginning point, like it starts with just being willing as a society to invest a lot more in education. Yeah. And I'm not one who believes that money can solve everything in education. I think there's a lot of waste in money in education. But I do think investing in compensation is absolutely critical to address what you're talking about. Yeah. And you mentioned, the basics, adults, a good teacher who cares. One thing I definitely wanted to ask about is the role of AI and technology in education and kind of how that's changing. I have read wildly different takes about it being the great leveler, where every kid has access to a 24/7 tutor who can tailor to them and personalize. And then other people who are saying all you're doing is taking humans away from it'll be a furthering that trend of taking human access away from kids, especially kids without access to means and resources in public schools. And so now the differentiator will be rich kids who have access to technology and people. Yeah. Like, curious how you see it. What are you excited about? What are you worried about?
I think both arguments have a lot of validity. And I guess what I would say is I tend to fall out on these sort of things. And this is not going to, I don't take either one of those positions. I tend to just sort of say that it's the fine line. You have to find the balance between them. I don't think, for those who think AI is going to be the answer to all of our issues around education equity and access to information, I don't believe that to be true. I don't think, and I've been thinking about the role of technology in education for a long time. I've always believed technology should play a role. I think we have to invest there. I think we have to figure out how we leverage the latest technology like AI to support a child's education. But it is a tool. And if we treat it as a tool in the same way that when I was coming up, a calculator was a tool, and my parents thought the world was falling apart because I wasn't going to learn how to do math anymore because I had a calculator. My teachers figured out that it was just a tool that I needed to be able, and it made life more efficient. And I learned valuable skills leveraging that tool. I think if we treat AI in the same way, I think it can be a powerful support to a child's education, and the amount of access to information they have now is incredible. And I think we just need to teach kids how to leverage it. Where I think the dangerous path is if we believe and we think that technology is going to replace the importance of human interaction. And I see some folks that go down this path. I mean, I think we even saw it coming out of the pandemic. A lot of youth serving organizations, including Boys and Girls Clubs, struggle to get kids back into the clubs after the pandemic. And it wasn't necessarily just because parents were afraid of like the health reasons for sending their kids back into the club. It was they became dependent upon devices and thought devices could make up for what their kids were otherwise going to have experienced at the club setting. And we've had to do a lot of work around really challenging parents' notions around like the role of technology and how it can't and shouldn't replace the human interactions that kids have. So I think as long as we find that right balance, and I tend to have confidence that over time, society, the pendulum will shift and then we'll realize we've gone too far. Yeah. And then we'll figure out how to calibrate. It's just like cell phones right now. I mean, it's interesting. There are very few school administrators that sat around. I remember I was a principal when kids first started getting access to cell phones. And I absolutely banned them in my school. You were not allowed to have a cell phone. I had 3 kids who were allowed to bring a cell phone, but they had to come and check in with me, went in my desk drawer, and they got it at the end of the day. And now we're 20 years later, every kid has a cell phone now. Yeah. They're a massive problem in schools. And finally, we see just this week, Marietta school superintendent came out. They have a new policy where they're banning them in middle schools. Yeah. It's such a bold move, but I think it's crazy that it's a bold move now. But it is because parents are, in an uproar about it. Yeah. Now they have a whole solution around it that's so innovative that, they're locking them in pouches and doing all these other things. But I say that to say the pendulum is starting to shift back where people are recognizing, okay, overutilization of cell phones in schools is a problem and we're going to solve for it. Yeah. So I have a little bit of confidence that like humans will evolve and figure out how to find that balance.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to a Dave Chappelle show and we all zipped our cell phone in that thing and it had like the locking, like you were stealing something from a department store. Yeah. And I was like, all right, this is going to be in every school. Yeah. Because you're not going to use them.
That's what they're heading towards now. Yeah. Although I saw a parent on the news last night who was not happy about it at all. She's like, what happens if there's a mass shooting in the school and my kid can't call me? I'm like, we figured out how to deal with emergencies before cell phones a long time ago.
Yeah, they'll let you know.
Yeah, you'll find out.
Yeah, but the basic logic that if your kid can text you, your kid can text anybody. Yes. And it is impossible to listen and do that at the same time. So like fundamentally, you got to figure that out.
And to be clear, texting is not what I think teachers are worried about.
Yeah, true.
It's everything else they're doing on their phones.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that's even the baseline. Like we just said, something that precludes you from listening isn't the problem.
Yes.
It's all the graver problems. Right. If you were advising parents and recognizing what you just said about being a late adopter, but if you're advising parents who are trying to think about navigating things like technology and screen time, like how should they come to a decision that they're comfortable about that's going to not socially ostracize their kid, but also allow them to still kind of be in charge of their education and not become captive to a phone?
It's a great question. And I'm with parents often who I think are navigating this, obviously. And I see parents often talk about the guilt they feel around letting their kids spend time with their devices. I was talking to a mom the other day whose working mom on my team. And she was like, David, I gave her the device and I just let her go because I needed to get some work done. And I feel terrible about it. I was like, don't. Parents have been doing that with TVs, et cetera, for many years. I always think it's about the trust you build with your child. And I think at the end of the day, you have to set boundaries for kids and, having very clear boundaries of like, this is the amount of time we have device time. And these are the sites you're allowed to be on. I will have access to your phone. I will have access to your device. I will look at what you're doing. I will have all your passwords and like building those kinds of norms early on. And then starting that from the very beginning where there's just no question about, a parent's ability to monitor what the child are doing. The good news is there's so many tools now for parents to be able to do that I think kids' workarounds of those are becoming less and less a challenge. And I just think at the end of the day, it's the same fundamentals of like relationships you have to build with your kid, where you build the kind of trust and hold them accountable for what your expectations are.
It strikes me as easier to navigate that if you're localizing it within a broader context of expectations in a culture of excellence, like what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And if you know that you're using that device as part of an aim towards development and growth and not just for like passive mindless entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the expectation that you're setting on all things, that can probably cascade down there too.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I would love to talk about some of the challenges that the families that you all are serving are encountering and what you're seeing out in the marketplace and with families. And a story that I have is people are asking, who's this podcast for? Like, what's the audience? And when I think about some of the challenges that people likely listening to this are navigating, it's around the fact that they could give all of their time and effort into a career pursuit. But they're trying to figure out, all right, how do I balance that expenditure of time with wanting to have a good, holistic, integrated life?
Yeah.
And I think the audience is well-intentioned. Like they want the world to work well. They want to leave it better than they are, than they found it. But they're also navigating what feels like a really full plate.
Yeah.
And in that, I think it can be easy to be disconnected from the day-to-day challenges of, we were talking about how there's two different Atlantas and different people in different Atlanta have really different challenges. They can probably feel disconnected, certainly speaking for myself and others, from the challenges of some single parent households or some folks who don't have the same economic means and resources and opportunities. Like, is that fair to feel that disconnect? And how should folks think about bridging that and their role in building equity in Atlanta?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's fair. And I think it's just the reality that as you said, you don't know what you're not exposed to. But I think the first step is acknowledging ignorance around it or lack of exposure and lack of access to experiences that would even allow you to be able to relate to someone else's experience. By acknowledging it, then you have to do something about it. And sometimes I think we make things harder than it has to be. I mean, I think you could, go get fully integrated into another community to fully understand what's happening. But I don't know that it has to be that complex. I think there are ways that I see folks that I have the chance to work with all the time who are intentional about how they use their time. I think about a gentleman I was talking to yesterday who serves on our DeKalb County board. We have a county board structure. He's an executive, very successful business career, doesn't live in the communities where our clubs operate, but he's been involved with our movement for 20 plus years and has a deep commitment to what we do with the Boys and Girls Clubs and has spent enough time in our clubs and around the challenges that our families are facing where I think it's safe to say that he has a pretty good understanding. He doesn't have their lived experience, but he has an appreciation for and empathy for what their experiences are to be able to go into his work environment and his home environment and have some context for conversations that he might be engaging in. I see a number of our board members like that who are very, we're not asking a ton of their time every month. We're asking a couple of hours every month that they're coming and connecting to our movement. But I see many of them who will take their kids then into volunteer at a club. And so it becomes a family experience where they're getting into the community. They're beginning to see people who look different than them and who have different life experiences than them. And I think the more that parents are intentional about doing that with their kids, where it's not, and I think you have to be careful as a parent, where it doesn't feel like, oh, we're going to serve the poor little black kids on the south side of town today, where it's really just a natural experience where like, we're going to go do some work at the club. You're going to hang out with kids too. And, we're going to help kids today by serving snack or whatever the thing is. I just think the more intentional families are and individuals are about engaging and finding their way, I think there are so many ways to plug in this city. I mean, that's the great thing, is that there's not a lack of opportunities. If you want to volunteer, if you want to connect, that's an easy way. I mean, I also think this is where I on a personal level, when I think about my own development and my understanding about issues around race and class and equity and all the things that are central to what I do from a career perspective, I did a lot of work on the career side and have had lots of professional experiences. But the thing that probably has had the most profound impact on me as a person and that has informed the way I lead in this space has been a friendship with someone who's lived a completely different life than me, who honestly, when we first met, and this was all through Lead Atlanta, actually, when we first met, could not be more different, see the world differently. And we had so many like debates and tough conversations that sharpened me as a person and really challenged the way I see the world. I say that to say that you can do the volunteer work and you can leave with a sort of surface level understanding, but it's not until you have deep relationships with people who are different than you, then I think you really begin to develop a true understanding of other people's perspectives on life. So I just encourage people beyond the surface level volunteering is have deep connections with people.
Yeah. Where would you encourage somebody to start?
It's a good question. I mean, I think oftentimes you could do it in the workplace. I mean, I think this is not always true, but I think a lot of opportunities in Atlanta, you work with people who are different than you, who come from different sides of the city. And I think it's a natural place. I always encourage people to like find the most natural way, like entry points. If it feels forced, people pick up on that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would encourage a white dude from Buckhead to go show up at a black church on a Sunday morning and try to build connections that way. Is probably not the way to do it. Yeah. But I do think, finding, organizations that, Hands on Atlanta is a great example of one where they have service projects. They have programs that allow you to not just show up at a one-time thing, but really plug in and get connected to people into the city. I think everyone has to find their own connection point. And I don't know. I think there's probably so many different entry points for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I've heard people say, like you said, around not forcing it, also finding like what feels exciting and not like an obligation.
Yeah. Right.
But just figuring out where to navigate that. Just to start.
I mean, I think public schools are a great way to do it if you live in a diverse community.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
what's the like the need? What's the option? I mean, I know the need is great, but like if you're thinking about a like archetypal volunteering or connection opportunity in a public school, like what is that?
Well, I guess the reason I bring up public schools is I feel like one of the challenges I see in education in Atlanta is the number of families who choose to send their kids to private schools. And at the end of the day, like families need to do what's best for their kids. And so I'll never fault a family for making the decision that is best for their individual kids. But we have some very solid public schools in Atlanta. And I think if more families were to choose to send their kids to public schools, we would have even better public schools in Atlanta. One of the reasons we don't is that so many of our, most affluent families choose to not send their kids there. But the point of bringing that up is to say, like, if we had more families who sent their kids to public schools, we would have more diverse schools where those natural connections happen. Because when kids generally, unless they have been taught to think a certain way, they're going to show up in a classroom as a kindergartner and they're going to see another kid and they're going to become friends with kids who are different than them. That then can lead to natural connections with families and parents, where I think it's just when I think about ways that young families and parents make friendships in this city, particularly if they're new to the city, it's often through their kids. It's play dates you do. It's those kinds of things. That's why I say if you send your kid to public school, you're more likely to build a diverse network of friends.
We kind of talked about education at large and then starting to localize it to families. Would love to talk a little bit about your journey and how you've maintained wellness, kind of whole person wellness in what has been a challenging career. Yeah. I'm curious, you talked about different challenges at different seasons. If you could unpack that a little bit. And then also, like, what has helped you stay grounded, stay motivated, navigate some of those?
I mean, when I look back at starting, for my career in Atlanta, I started off, college graduate out of Chapel Hill, ambitious, like hardworking. I was in a grind from the day my feet hit the ground here in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I stayed in that grind for a pretty long time. And what I mean by that is, especially when I started, my own school, I was working late Saturday nights, Sundays. My car was always at the school. I probably went easily 100 days straight at work, no break at all, 15, 16-hour days. I mean, it was a grind. But I loved what I did, and I felt such satisfaction and fulfillment. I was also young. I had energy, so I could pull that off then. But it does start to wear on you, and I think what I recognize, honestly, in some of the hardest moments in those earlier days, it was the nights I couldn't sleep because I knew I had to fire someone the next day, or the nights I was wrestling with, was I going to expel this kid in this disciplinary hearing tomorrow, or was I going to give him one more chance? Is the conversation I'd had with a mom who cursed me out because of whatever her child did at school that day, that if you're not careful and attuned to how you are experiencing that, it can impact you, I think, more than you recognize. So I recently had the chance to go back to Atlanta Public Schools, and I walked into the central office, and this is after having been there for 6 years, and what was probably 6 of the toughest years of my career in terms of just the grind that I'm talking about. And literally, I felt my body tense up as I was walking in.
Yeah, somatic.
Yeah.
response.
And I just was like, wow, this is what I was carrying every day in this building. But I don't know that I recognized it at the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask, were you aware? Was there an acute event where you became aware? Did you change any kind of habits or practices, or like, what has that journey been like for you?
I don't know that there was any acute event. I mean, I think part of it just comes with age. Part of it comes with like getting to middle age, honestly. You wake up at 40 years old, and I wouldn't say I had a midlife crisis, because I didn't, but I was in my early 40s when the pandemic hit. And that was also the point at which I was doing a career transition from APS to Boys and Girls Clubs. Yeah. And my intent, for the first time ever, I had planned 5 weeks between jobs, which was like, that felt like a massive sabbatical that I'd never experienced before. And of course, it was in May of 2020 when literally you couldn't travel anywhere, and I was stuck in my condo. But it probably was the greatest blessing ever, because otherwise I probably would have just been traveling, keeping myself busy, because that's what I do, is I just keep myself busy. It forced me to sit down and to really think about, what do I want this next experience to feel like? How do I want to show up as a leader? But more importantly, how do I want to find the right balance? Because I can't live the second half of my life the way I lived the first half. I have zero regrets about the work that I've done and the commitment of time and the personal sacrifices I've made. And I know that I have not lived the best balanced life. And I haven't had, particularly on the relationship side and the personal side of like living life beyond just work. I didn't give myself the time and the space to like experience all that I think life has to offer. And I think that's not good personally, but I also think it's not great from a leadership perspective to be modeling that, because I think I was definitely the leader who showed up sick. And even though I never communicated to my employees that I expected them to show up sick, I modeled it all the time. And so I think at this point in life, I'm far more conscious around what I'm modeling, because I think I am aware that people look to you. Even I can say all the right things around take care of yourself. Yes, take the day off. Yeah. But if I'm not doing it myself, if I'm not taking a vacation and shutting off, if I'm not going to the gym, and that's one of the things I try to really model. I'm very clear with folks, like 5 o'clock, I'm heading out. I'll be at the gym. You can call me. I'll take your conference call on the treadmill, but I'm taking care of myself for at least 90 minutes in the evening. I'll probably be back online responding to emails. But I really am dedicated to like putting that in my calendar every day.
Hearing you say that, I have two voices. One is like, okay, like if you want the balance from day one, like that feels important. But on the other, it's like, but would you be you, and would you have achieved what you have achieved at KIPP and otherwise had you not gone that hard? And I think I have heard some version of that from a number of folks who have been very successful, and that question always comes up.
Yeah.
So would you counsel somebody who's younger and listening to this to protect themselves in that time and model the off days? Or did you like need that culture of excellence at KIPP, and like you needed folks to show up and bring it because y'all were trying to do something hard?
Yeah.
Like what's that line?
That's a great question, because I do think there is a danger, and I do think we have a generation of young people who have been taught that like put yourself first above all things, and don't necessarily have the work ethic that's required if they really do want to be successful and have a great impact. So I do think it's a fine line. I also believe that there are seasons where you just have to accept, especially as a leader, where this is just going to be a grind for the next several months. And I've got to have to just be clear, like the balance that I typically try to have, I'm not going to be able to have, because I'm going to have to prioritize work in this season. I think the danger comes when those seasons extend for multiple seasons and you really are not aware of the impact it's having on you. I also will say, like, particularly on the relational side, being in a relationship made me recognize it made me a better leader, because it puts a mirror up in front of you and you realize how you show up in a relationship is the same way you show up every day for the people you're managing. But sometimes being in a relationship, there's more honesty there, and you're seeing yourself day to day in a more intimate setting. And so in retrospect, I realized I probably would have been a better leader had I prioritized things like that earlier on in my career. That, I chose not to. And again, if I had not had the drive and work ethic that I had earlier in my career, would I have been able to get to do all the things that I did? Maybe not. I don't know. That's a sacrifice that's why I say I don't have really a lot of regrets about it. But I do think there's more to life than career. So I think that's the tricky balance.
And a lot of jobs require you to work a lot of hours and do a lot of things. Not all of those jobs come with the gut-wrenching emotional toll of something like you said around, having a child's future in your hands and you're the arbiter of that. When you were navigating those moments that were especially hard, or when it felt like, you're Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill and it keeps rolling back down, how did you go to the well and stay motivated in those times, and specific practices or foundations that you would rely on? Like what allows your flame to keep burning? It's
a good question. I mean, in some ways, and this is probably necessary, but not necessarily something I love. I do think over time you have to become desensitized. And what I mean by that is the emotional weight of like expelling a kid from school. The first few times I had to do it, it weighed so heavily on me that it became almost debilitating. And I really all I could think about was that kid. And I don't think I had perspective at times, where I put way too much value on what we were doing as a school and realized this kid's resilient. This kid's going to go to the next school. It's going to be fine. And I can't position our school or our organization to be the only savior for this kid. They're part of a village. I think part of it is just having perspective and having people around you that give you that perspective. So I think the answer to your question, I think first is it was surrounding myself with the right people who gave me and sometimes we're like a few years ahead in their experience to be able to just tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, don't take it as seriously as you're taking it. Because the more you let it weigh on you, the less effective you are. So I think there's that. I also think for me, even through most of those crazy years, and in some ways I'm in one of those years right now, the one thing that I have always come back to is my faith. And I do think that sort of the spiritual side of our being and our well-being is an important part of, I think, how we power through some of those tough seasons. And there have definitely been times when I look back, especially, there was a period for me where I had a couple of, traumatic experiences. My son took his life. I lost my brother, broke up with my partner, all within like a few month period. And all of that was while things were not great at work. And I look back on that and I do think it was my faith that sustained me through that season. And people around me that lifted me up and kept me encouraged. And I that's why I think relationships are so critical. And you can't call in relationships when you need them, only when you need them, if you haven't done the work to create them. And just going back to like how you find that balance in life, even when you're, keeping a busy career, I have always tried to prioritize relationships. And I'm not talking about romantic relationships, just friendships and like professional networks and relationships.
What has that looked like? Is that, a small group that you've met with consistently, or a handful of people standing time on the calendar? Like, what has kept those going? Yeah,
I think it's more and it's been initially a small group. It has grown over time, of course. There was a like many years ago, like a small, like religious, like Bible study type group. But more it became just a handful of people that I made a commitment to stay connected with. And it was, it might be a dinner, once a month or every couple of months.
Was that explicit and like codified? Like, we're going to do this? Or is it more like, hey, every time we do this, we realize it's a healthy thing. Let's not let it slip.
I think it's more the latter.
Okay.
Yeah. And then in a couple of cases, like my closest friend was someone where it was just sort of understood. And I think she needed me to be there for her as much as I needed her to be there for me. And we just became that for each other. And we've had such interesting life journeys. And we just had dinner last night. And, she's leading an organization right now and going through challenging times. And I'm leading one right now. And so we can commiserate over all the things that are terrible about work right now and laugh about it and give each other perspective about it. And I think everyone needs people like that in your corner who can relate to what you're going through.
Yeah, totally. I feel like that's good counsel for anybody listening. I feel that too. If we have a few more minutes, can we do a few lightning rounds?
Sure.
Okay. Feel free to pass, but I think we got some good ones. All right. Favorite Atlanta meal? That
should be a lot easier than it is for me. What is my favorite Atlanta meal?
Or you can list a few you're excited about if you need to be let off the hook.
I am a fan of just basic tacos and margaritas and guacamole.
Where do you go for tacos?
Margaritas Real Tacos in Midtown is my favorite taco spot. That or Bar Taco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Best book that you've read recently or gifted?
I just read a book called Culture Rules by a gentleman whose name is escaping me. I think it's Mark Miller. That's really around how you build a strong organizational culture. A great book.
What stuck out from it?
So he has been instrumental in helping Chick-fil-A create the culture that they've created. And if you follow businesses and successful businesses, Chick-fil-A is known for the organizational culture that they have. And he gives just really practical advice on the fundamentals of like how you set your aspirations for what you are wanting your organizational culture to look like, how you amplify that throughout your organization, and how you constantly are modifying that. And just, it's giving me a lot of food for thought as I'm working on shifting the culture within Boys and Girls Clubs right now.
Yeah. I remember touring it for the first time in 2014 or 15. I was doing some volunteer work with the Peach Bowl. And I was like, what is this place? Like, I was doing
special place,
management consulting, going to all these companies. And then I was like, I haven't been to many like this.
Yeah.
It's quite a different feel.
Yeah. I was interviewing, we have a gentleman on our board who joined us a couple of years ago, and I was going through an interview process with him as he was coming onto our board. And he told me, I forget how many months he said he went through the vetting process to get hired by them, but it sounded, like months and months and multiple rounds of conversations before they brought anybody on. And it said a lot about the rigorous process they have in place for selecting talent. If you meet people from there, particularly people in leadership roles, it's very evident that they put a lot of effort into who they select to come into their company. Yeah. And it pays off in dividends.
Yeah, totally. Last one. Is there a habit or a norm that you see us embracing maybe by default in popular culture, modern culture, that you think isn't serving us well, and that you think people should do less of this, and maybe what should they replace that with?
The first thing that comes to mind is one of my biggest pet peeves is sitting in a restaurant and seeing a couple sitting across from each other with both of them on their phones. I just think we are attached to our phones in a way that is unhealthy. And I laugh because I'm the worst at it. Like we've been going to this conversation for over an hour, and I'm so anxious about what's happening on my phone right now. But I think about, there was a time when these phones were not a part of our lives, and society went on and we figured out how to function. So as much as I am guilty of it, I think my advice to society would be, we need to put our devices down and replace it with the kind of conversation we're having.
It is wild. Like, mine are recording us right now, so I don't have them, but it is crazy the amount of times where I think about, like, all right, I'm not going to have phone for the next hour. Like, what if something happens or somebody needs me? And then I'm like, well, what about from like the entire 1900s?
Right.
Like, they seem to manage a trip to the gym without their phone.
Exactly.
Okay. Like, it is wildly different.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for all you're doing and the ways you inspired me and so many others, and the way you continue to give of yourself to education for our city. Thanks for making this time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, David.
Absolutely.
That's our show for today. Thank you, David, for spending time with us. Thank you for all of you for listening to Macon Atlanta. We're talking big questions, bold ideas, better living. If you have suggestions, questions, know anyone we should speak with, please don't hesitate to reach out. Good luck out there. Y'all are doing great. Appreciate y'all spending time today.